Do you ever feel like no matter what, your crochet project is a flop? Like you're not sure exactly what you've done wrong or where the problem's coming from, but you know something's wrong? Maybe you watched my last video on being an average crocheter and felt like maybe you weren't quite average. So if you're not getting any better at crochet, here's what you need to do. We're going to go pretty basic on some of these troubleshooting issues, and it might be a little basic for you, but if you watch this video and you see a few things that I've missed, please feel free to put them down in the comments just to help benefit anyone who might really be feeling stuck right now. And first thing that you need to do if you are feeling totally stuck and you're not able to get your crochet projects to turn out any better is I want you to check out the patterns you're using and check and see if they're written in US or UK terminology. There is a difference, and depending on what part of the world you're in, depending on, you know, where you're buying your pattern from, since we can buy them all online now, you know, where's this pattern originating from? Is it UK or US terms? Because there is a big difference. And I know there's a lot of people out there who have done great videos on that differences in that terminology. So you can totally just put that into your search bar if you find out you've been doing the wrong terminology. A double crochet means something totally different in US versus UK terms. So you want to make certain that you're using the right terminology and that you know what stitch you're supposed to be using, because you can have disastrous results. I love winging a project as much as anybody, but the reality is if you don't have a lot of experience and you're not super familiar, you should probably be doing patterns instead of, you know, going off and freestyling at this point. You do need to follow the directions on the pattern, and one of the first things you need to do is use the correct hook size and the yarn size, and we'll get into the yarn in a minute, but you want to make sure you're using the correct hook size that this pattern is calling for. And if this pattern offers a gauge, it would be beneficial to make up a gauge swatch. There's so many different opinions out there on doing a gauge swatch, and I know people feel like you're wasting your time, and I will admit I'm the first to not do one, but if you're really struggling and you're not sure what you're doing wrong and you're not getting the results and you feel like they're just not turning out, I would strongly encourage you, if that pattern offers a gauge, to follow that and really make sure, because that can let you know if your tension is way off, or it could let you know if the hook and yarn just aren't matching up to what the pattern writer wants it to be. If you're using too big of a hook, your project is going to turn out much larger than it was designed to. So some things that might not matter. Maybe it's like a loose flowy cardigan. It's probably not going to make a difference. But if you're making somebody a beanie that's supposed to be kind of tight and it's turning out way too large, that's definitely not going to work. Be mindful of the pattern's required hook size and the gauge swatch. While we're talking about the pattern requirements, let's talk about the yarn. A lot of patterns are written for specific yarns, but the reality is we don't always have the yarns that are called for, and maybe we don't want to purchase any more yarn. Maybe we're wanting to just shop out of our stash, which I always recommend. In that case, if you're not using the specific yarn it calls for, you need to make sure that you are using an extremely compatible yarn. So that is going to be the same thickness of the yarn. And if you're not sure what I mean by that, yarn labels all have the weight of the yarn on here. So this is a 2-weight yarn right here. And if you're not sure, you can always type into Google if you see a word you're not familiar with, like sock yarn, fingering weight yarn, sport yarn, DK, worsted yarn. Any of those terms you can type into Google and just find out what the number would be on that so that you're able to have the right size, because again, that can have disastrous results in something that needs a specific size. The other thing that is important if you are trying to find a suitable yarn to substitute for the pattern is you're going to want want to make sure that you're using the same fiber of yarn that the pattern's calling for. So this particular yarn is 100% acrylic. So if that pattern called for a different 2-weight 100% acrylic, I could substitute this and not worry about it. If the pattern called for a 4-weight 100% acrylic, this would not work. If the pattern called for something totally different, like a 2-weight 100% wool, I probably wouldn't use this either. You want to find something that is going to have the same feeling. So if this is a piece that is going to need a little bit of stretch to it, you need to be aware of that in the yarn. You can't pick like a super stiff cotton that isn't going to have stretch to it if the yarn in question has some stretch to it. I hope that makes sense. I know I'm being kind of vague there. Say you're working on a project that doesn't have like the specific size requirements like a wearable would. Maybe you're working on a blanket, but when you get the blanket, it's just not laying right, or it feels very stiff, feels very thick and not drapey. Has the yarn you've picked out, like, does the texture, the right texture it should be for a blanket? Because for me, having something like super stiff and scratchy kind of ruins a project for me if I need it to be like soft and like drapey and cuddly, like wrapping myself up in. The texture is going to make a huge difference. And we all have different preferences about what we're looking for. But like, for example, one time I saw an Instagram post by someone who was making like a little crochet top, like those, I don't know, like a crop top type of situation, kind of came down into a triangle. The gal was using Red Heart Super Saver, which I love, but it is a stiff acrylic. It is not drapey. And between the yarn and her hook size, it was very tight. And it had created like a total triangle point coming down in front off of her bust line. And, you know, she had posted like, this is not working at all. And I for the life of me, I cannot remember who that was at all that had posted that, but that's just an example. Like, that particular yarn was not the right texture for that project. So you could be getting the stitches right. You could be getting, you know, the gauge right, but it might not be the right texture of yarn for that project. So again, if you're working off of a pattern, that's why that's so important to find a compatible yarn to what the crochet designer intended it to be. A mistake that so many of us are guilty of is when we're working on a pattern and we get our stitch count off. And for some reason, I used to always hate stitch markers. Like, I couldn't be bothered with the 2 seconds it would take to put a stitch marker in. But what I have learned about myself is I can really only count to about 20 without losing my count. So for me, if I'm working on, you know, something that's a longer panel, I have to put a stitch marker in every 20 stitches. Otherwise, I'm just counting and counting and recounting, and then I lose my count. And, you know, I've wasted 10 minutes just trying to count one row. It can be fairly detrimental to a pattern if you are getting your stitch count wrong. I know I have seen countless blankets, which I have been guilty of too. Don't worry, I'm not excluding myself. If you're starting out and then it starts going in, you know, or say it starts getting wider, that means you're either not getting enough stitches in or you're putting too many stitches in. Could be from accidentally putting, you know, 2 in the same stitch. It could be from miscalculating on the ends. There's a lot of different ways we can count wrong. But that is something that is a very easy mistake to make, and it's perfectly avoidable just by using some stitch markers. So definitely that is a tiny, tiny detail that can have a huge impact. Also helpful for keeping track of what row you're on, if that's something where your pattern requires that. It's really helpful just to know, like, okay, I'm counting my row across and putting one in every 20, and then those move up every row, but say maybe every 10 rows or every 5 rows or however many rows, you put a stitch marker going up so that you know and can count up that way. Or if you know, like at a certain point you put a decrease or an increase in, you want to mark that row so you know. And stitch markers are not expensive. You can find all sorts of them. You can find tons on Amazon or even at like Joann or anything like that. The next two things on this list, if you're really feeling like you just can't get your crochet to turn out any better, are going to be two don'ts. The rest were kind of do's. These are don'ts. The first one is going to be when you're in this beginning process and learning something new and maybe still trying to learn stitches, or you're trying to learn new stitches or a new pattern, don't use novelty yarn. I love novelty yarns, don't get me wrong, but they're notoriously hard to work with. Sometimes you're pairing them with another yarn, but oftentimes it's like either an eyelash yarn or a fuzzy yarn or a chenille yarn. And you can't actually see the stitches. Like, you have to go by feel. And trust me, if you're still struggling with some of these basics, you do not want to mess around with having to feel for your stitches and feel where to stick your crochet hook. You want something that is going to have it clearly defined so you can see exactly where you should be crocheting. And the other don't is, don't try to teach yourself how to crochet by picking an intricate pattern. I recently did a video on why some particular Dollar Tree amigurumi kits are not for beginners. I will link that if you're curious in seeing that. But how many people do you think are there in the store and they see that and the packaging looks cute and they're like, oh, I've been wanting to learn to crochet. I'm going to take this home and learn. That is a bad idea. Number one, the Dollar Tree instructions were horrible. So, like I said, that's a whole other story and you can watch the video if you want to see that. If you haven't learned basic stitches, you need to start out just actually practicing making some squares, making some rectangles, and just frogging it all out. If you don't know what frogging means, it means just ripping it all out and just working on getting those stitches, working on getting your count right. Don't try a big project. I think that's probably a super common reason why people give up on crochet, is because they've picked something that is just flat out way too hard for their skill level, and that's how they try to learn it. And even if you had the best written pattern in the world, a beginner who's never even really made like a dishcloth or anything like that should not be starting on something where you're crocheting in the round and making increases and decreases. And if you're not sure what those words are, then you definitely shouldn't be doing that. I want to point out that you need to be familiar with the different abbreviations. And I know I touched on the terminology a little bit in the first thing with the UK and the US, but when you're reading a pattern and you see certain abbreviations popping up, you need to know what those are. And you can definitely Google it if you're not sure. I found a bunch of charts online. I just did a Google search and like Pinterest and other stuff popped up, but there's definitely charts you can have on hand. You can literally just write them down in a notebook. But you need to know what those abbreviations stand for. And maybe I should take a step back, but I do want to say that the other thing you need to do is to read your entire pattern before you start crocheting, because at that point you're going to know if you need to double check anything. Assuming you've already checked, you know, the yarn, the hook, and all of that good stuff, you want to read through it, find out if there's any terms you don't understand, find out if there's any abbreviations you need to look up. If there's some stitches in there that, you know, sound familiar, but like you think you know how to do, just do a quick search on YouTube and find a quick tutorial to show you how to do that stitch. I have a friend, her channel is Sweet Moments by Jessie, and she's got a ton of basic stitches on her channel. It's just a great resource to pop over there, you know, just watch for a couple minutes, try a couple of the stitches out, make sure that you really understand what you're doing before you get into that pattern, because you might even find that that's not the pattern for you. And how bad would that be to get like halfway through a big project and realize you're in over your head. And if you feel like you already are doing all of these things, then what I really want you to be mindful of is that maybe you need to slow down, limit your distractions, and be realistic about what you can do at this point. What I mean by this is don't be in a hurry for your project. If you're finding you're still struggling and you don't like how your projects are turning out, you need to give that project a little more extra attention. Really make sure, go back and double check, make sure you've got the right amount of stitches before you go to the next row. Make sure you've got the right amount of rows. Really take your time and enjoy the process of it. You know, don't start a project like a couple days before somebody's birthday. Give yourself months in advance if you need to, just so that you can have the time to slow down and you don't have pressure, because I know I'm far more apt to make mistakes if I'm hurrying. Limiting distractions. I know a lot of us watch TV while we're crocheting, but we're kind of like half watching, half not. If you find that you're making mistakes and you're just not liking how your crochet is turning out, that's probably a sign that maybe you need to find a nice quiet spot in your house or a coffee shop or a library or somewhere where you can really limit the amount of chaos going on, because until you're more familiar with stitches and techniques, it's going to be beneficial for you to be able to really zone in on that project. And by being realistic, it kind of goes with what I said before about not trying to learn on a really difficult project, but it goes a little bit more. Patterns will usually tell you at the top, if it's a good, well-written pattern, what the skill level is. Easy, intermediate. So there's a starting point right there, but sometimes it's a whole combination of different things. You know, it could be the type of yarn, it could be the stitch, it could be the amount of time you have to make the project. You know, there's all sorts of things that kind of all go together. You know, the texture of the yarn is a big thing. You know, I know when I was working on this, it was wool sock yarn and I enjoyed working on it, but the yarn kind of like pulled and stuck to itself when I was working on it. It was fine because I was using a larger hook because I wanted this to be drapey. You know, some yarn textures are just, it like pulls against itself. Also, if you have to frog it and pull it out, it sticks and sometimes it does not frog easily and you might have to cut yarn if it's like really entangled in there, where some yarns are just nice and smooth. So the pattern could be too difficult for a whole number of things. There is absolutely no shame in getting into it and just being like, you know what, I still love this. I can come back to it at a later point in my crochet journey when I'm a little more apt to finish it and not have it be stressful, and just back off and take it down a little bit and do something a little bit easier. I just did a video on being an average crocheter, and one of the things I mentioned in that about being average is I like doing patterns that are below my skill level, because once in a while I want to challenge myself, but a lot of the time I just want to make something for myself and I don't want it to be like a strenuous learning activity. I want to chill out on the couch with the TV and just enjoy myself crocheting. And for whatever reason, if you need to take it down a level, that is okay. You are not alone if you are feeling stuck and feeling like your crochet just isn't what you want it to be. Like, it just isn't good enough. Everybody's been there at different points. And to keep things in perspective, my friend who, I called her my crochet tutor, she learned to crochet when she was 9 years old. She'd been crocheting like 50 years when she taught me. Ton of experience and really good, and she makes a lot of baby afghans and baby dresses and like baby cardigans because that's what she enjoys doing. But I remember like a year ago she was so mad at an amigurumi pattern, and you know, like I said, she's got a ton of experience. She knows all the terminology. She knows, you know, she has experience with different yarns, but this project was just so different and so out of her wheelhouse that even though it wasn't like a expert level pattern, for her, it was just hard because it wasn't what she was used to. And there is no shame in that at all. So we've all been there. We've all felt stuck. We've all felt like our project just turned out like complete crap. Like, we've all been there. I've even had projects where I followed the pattern perfectly. I used a great yarn and I got done and I was like, I hate this. And that just happens sometimes too. So if you have a beginner crocheter in your life, I would love it if you would share this video and send this to them to help give them a little bit of encouragement. And if you are an intermediate or advanced or expert level crocheter, again, please, if I missed anything, please put that down in the comments, just so that someone who is struggling can go through and read the comments and maybe find another little tidbit of advice there. Because I always like write notes and I write everything down and I try to look at my notes, but honestly, like sometimes I just forget things. I do appreciate your help. As always, thank you so much for talking yarn with me. I will have a video right up here for you if you'd like to watch more. Bye.